The second light was smaller, sharper, moving faster than any helicopter, and as it rose above the ridge, Kara realized what it was. A drone armed, heavy, and controlled from somewhere far beyond the canyon. She felt her stomach tighten as the machine locked its searchlight onto the rescue craft above the hum, rising to a high electric pitch. She could see the rotors of the friendly helicopter tilt as it tried to maneuver away the pilot, aware of the danger, but the drone was already releasing a streak of fire through the dark sky. The missile cut through the air in a white line of light, the explosion that followed splitting the night open with blinding heat and noise. Kara threw herself flat against the ground as metal rained from above, pieces of the rescue craft spinning into the canyon walls, burning in midair. The shockwave rolled through her chest, stealing her breath, the sound echoing over and over until it was swallowed by the mountains. When she looked up, the sky was filled with falling ash and smoke, and the only light left came from the flames licking at the wreckage high on the ridge. She pressed her palms into the sand, her heartbeat wild, her mind already running through options. But there were few. The extraction was gone. The enemy survivors were still somewhere in the canyon, and the drone was circling again, its beam sweeping across the basin, methodical, precise hunting. She crawled behind a boulder, the stone rough against her palms, her breath shallow. She watched the light pass inches from her boots and forced herself to stay still, her body shaking not from fear but from exhaustion. The drone moved on its sensors, scanning the wreckage, its hum fading for a moment. Kara used that pause to move low, across the ground toward the shattered remains of her stolen helicopter. The cockpit was cracked open, wires hanging like vines, sparks flickering from the control board. She climbed inside, crouched low, and reached under the main console, searching for the emergency panel. She found it by touch, a small compartment where survival tools were stored. Her fingers closing around a small signal jammer, an old model, but still functional. If it had any power left, she pulled it free, flipped the switch. The tiny light flickered once, then steadied, faint but alive. She adjusted the frequency dial, praying it would interfere with the drone's systems even briefly. The air around her buzzed with static for a second, then silence. The hum outside shifted, slightly as if confused, the drone hovering uncertain above the canyon rim. Kara took that moment and ran her legs screaming in protest, the sand sliding under her boots. She darted from one shadow to another, heading toward the far edge of the basin, where the rocks sloped upward into a narrow trail. Behind her, the drone's searchlight flared bright again, sweeping across the canyon. The hum rising in pitch, it had reacquired her position. She could hear it descending lower, the wind from its rotors, kicking up waves of dust. She pushed herself harder, ignoring the pain. The trail ahead steep and jagged, the kind of climb that shredded hands and tore boots. Her lungs burned, each breath like glass in her throat, but she didn't stop. She could hear the machine's sensors locking again, the sound changing from a hum to a whine that meant it was preparing to fire. She threw herself behind a rock ledge just as the missile hit the ground behind her, the blast hurling her forward, the heat searing her back. She landed hard, her vision spinning, but she kept moving, crawling upward through the smoke. Her hand brushed metal, and she realized she had reached the old wreck from earlier, the remains of that ancient aircraft, its frame half buried, but intact enough to offer cover. She ducked inside the broken fuselage, the interior dark and cool, the smell of oil and sand thick in the air. The sound outside faded, slightly muffled by the steel walls. She sat against the inner hull, catching her breath, her hands trembling as she checked the jammer, still flickering faintly. She turned it higher, the static growing until she could barely hear the drone through the interference. For a few seconds, she allowed herself to think, to breathe. She thought of the mission that had led her here, the betrayal, the faces of her crew, the radio transmission that should never have reached the enemy. She remembered the last words of her co-pilot before the crash trust. No one The words echoed in her head now, sharp and real. Outside, the drone passed again, its searchlight weaker distorted by the jammer. She watched the light slide over the canyon walls before drifting away toward the wreckage below. Maybe it had lost her. Maybe only for a few moments, but moments were all she needed. She looked around the fuselage, noticing a rusted crate wedged in the corner. She pried it open inside, were old munitions, shells, ammunition, and a flare of larger caliber than the one she had used before. She inspected it, realizing it could fit the grenade launcher mounted under the broken helicopter cockpit. The idea hit her fast and dangerous. She could lure the drone in close use the flare as a decoy, then hit it from below. If she timed it perfectly, it might work. She took the flare, tucked it under her arm, and climbed back out into the open night. The wind had shifted, carrying the smell of smoke from the destroyed extraction craft. She crouched low, scanning the sky until she caught sight of the faint silhouette of the drone against the stars, a moving shadow circling back toward her. She sprinted toward the downed helicopter. The flare clutched tight, her boots kicking up sand, every muscle in her body screaming for rest, but her mind locked on the plan. She reached the wreck, slid into the cockpit, her fingers finding the old weapon mount beneath the console. She snapped the flare into place, aimed straight up toward where she estimated the drone would appear, and fired. The flare streaked, skyward bright white against the black sky, and as she expected, the drone's sensors locked onto it, immediately diving toward the light. Kara ducked out from the wreck, moving fast to the side, the launcher's recoil ringing in her bones. She grabbed the last shell from the crate, loaded it by hand, aimed through the broken glass of the cockpit, and waited until the hum grew deafening. The drone broke through the smoke above her, its sensors flaring red, the flare's reflection still blinding. She squeezed the trigger, the shell erupting from the barrel, a streak of fire cutting through the night. The explosion lit the canyon from end to end, a wave of heat rolling over the sand, the drone splitting into shards of metal that rained like meteors across the rocks. The sound hit seconds later, a crack of thunder that shook the ground. She fell back into the sand, her chest heaving, the night returning to silence, only the wind whispering across the wreckage. She lay still for a long moment, listening to the ringing in her ears, the faint hum of cooling metal, the smell of burned circuitry. Then from far away beyond the canyon, she heard another sound, faint, rhythmic, distant, but growing louder, the unmistakable beat of rotor blades, not one but several this time, coming fast from the direction of the horizon. She sat up slowly, her eyes narrowing because she knew by instinct those weren't her people, not yet, and the fight was far from over. Kara pressed herself against the sand, her chest heaving, the heat from the destroyed drone still clinging to the canyon walls around her. She could hear the distant thrum of the approaching rotors, faster, closer, and she knew instinctively that these were not friendly craft, not the rescue team she had contacted over the radio. These were new hunters, trained precise and lethal, and they had already spotted the debris of the flare from before. Her mind raced, calculating angles, trajectories, escape routes, anything that would give her a chance. The canyon around her was silent except for the wind shifting the sand and the faint metallic groan of the downed helicopters, the jagged remains she had used as cover. The new aircraft appeared over the ridge, cutting across the sky like black birds of prey, their searchlights sweeping the basin in a deliberate grid pattern. She ducked low behind a boulder, heart hammering her hands, slick with sweat. The rifle from the wreckage clutched tightly against her chest. She weighed her options. The canyon walls, narrow but high, offering potential cover and concealment. If she could reach the ledge above without being spotted, she crawled low, moving fast, each handhold calculated, every movement precise. Her boots scraped against loose rock and gravel, each sound amplified in her ears. But the shadows of the hunters moved methodically over the terrain. She could see one of them break off, dipping lower, scanning the area directly above her position. She froze, letting the wind carry her, scent and movement away from their sensors. Her mind replayed every training drill she had learned, every survival tactic, every evasive maneuver from her years as a pilot-soldier strategist. She could hear the engine hums echoing off the canyon walls. Growing closer each second, she spotted a faint shadow across the basin, the last flare's light reflecting on a piece of metal, and realized the hunters were using it as a reference point closing in. She forced herself to breathe slow to keep the panic from swallowing her. She scrambled upward toward a narrow ledge, the rock face cutting into her palms, nails breaking skin, but she kept moving. Her legs screamed from the climb, her lungs burning, but she could feel herself gaining height above the open basin. She reached the ledge and rolled over the edge just as a searchlight swept beneath her position, illuminating the jagged rocks where she had been seconds before. She froze low on the ledge, heart-hammering adrenaline flooding through her veins. The hunters paused, scanning below the ledge, their shadows stretching long across the canyon floor. She could see the glint of their weapons, the precision of their formation, and she knew that even a single mistake would be F. The desert spun below her like a living storm wind, and heat and sand merging into a single endless blur. Kara felt the helicopter shudder beneath her hands, the instruments flickering, the warning tone rising again, louder, more insistent. She glanced at the display, her heart tightening, as she saw the small red dot closing fast from behind a missile locked and tracking. The blast from her earlier explosion must have triggered a response from the outpost defense system, and now she was flying straight into a kill zone. Her fingers moved automatically, switches flicking systems, rerouting her instincts, taking over where logic could not, the old training coming back with the precision of muscle memory. She threw the helicopter into a dive, the horizon tilting violently, the ground surging upward in a blur of dust and flame. The missile streaked overhead, a line of white fire cutting across the sky, and exploded far ahead, shaking the air with a deafening roar. She leveled the craft, the engine screaming in protest, the vibrations crawling up her arms, but she kept control, steadying her breath. Her eyes locked on the far ridge, smoke trailed behind her, a thin gray ribbon against the endless blue, and she knew she had only minutes before. They scrambled another interceptor, or worse, a drone. She reached to her side, pulling the dead pilot's headset over her ears, static buzzing in her skull until a faint voice broke through, clipped sharp in the language of her captors. They were tracking her, giving coordinates to a nearby base, her window of escape closing by the second. She switched frequencies quickly, scanning for anything familiar, any signal from her own side, but only static answered back. Her throat was dry, her hands slick with sweat, the desert stretching out below without mercy or cover. The helicopter trembled again, the fuel gauge dipping dangerously low from the climb and the damage from the earlier firefight. She glanced out the cracked windshield and saw movement on the horizon, faint black specks growing larger by the second helicopter's military grade, closing in from the north. They were coming fast, and she was outnumbered. She banked hard to the left, heading toward the canyon line she remembered. From her flight days, a deep scar in the desert floor, narrow enough that pursuit would be dangerous, even for experienced pilots. The air buffeted her from every side, the rotors screaming, the frame rattling with every gust. She dove lower the walls of the canyon, rising around her, the sunlight cutting into narrow golden beams that flickered across the cockpit. The radio crackled again, voices overlapping commands and confusion. They hadn't expected her to still be airborne this long, she thought. With grim satisfaction, she guided the helicopter deeper into the canyon, weaving between rock spires, the rotors slicing air inches from stone. The sound echoed off the walls, magnified into a storm of noise, her heartbeat syncing with the pulse of the machine. She caught sight of a narrow opening ahead, a side tunnel wide enough to fly through, but barely. The pursuing aircraft were gaining distance, shrinking the gap, their shadows sweeping across the canyon floor like hunting hawks. She clenched, her jaw and pushed the throttle, the helicopter surging forward faster than was safe, but safety had long stopped being an option. As she entered the narrow passage, the world seemed to tighten around her, every movement precise, every second stretched. She could see the rocks scraping, the skid sparks flashing in the dim light, but she held steady, the controls an extension of her hands. Her mind drifted for a heartbeat to the day of her capture, the ambush, the betrayal someone had fed her coordinates, to the enemy, someone close, and the thought burned hotter than the desert sun. She would find out who once she survived this, and she intended to survive. The tunnel opened suddenly into a wide basin ringed by cliffs, the light exploding across her vision. She pulled up sharply, the helicopter lifting into open sky, and for a moment there was quiet, only the hum of the rotors and her own breathing. Then a shadow crossed above her, and she looked up to see one of the pursuing helicopters descending, fast guns trained on her position. The radio hissed again, a voice sharp, demanding her surrender. She ignored it, pulling the stick to the side, sending her aircraft rolling in a desperate maneuver that made her stomach twist, but kept her alive. Gunfire tore through the air tracers, streaking past the windshield. She felt one round slam into the tail rotor, the entire machine jolting violently. She fought the controls, the helicopter spinning once-twice before she managed to stabilize it low and erratic near the canyon rim. Another burst of gunfire shredded the air above her. She ducked instinctively, metal fragments raining from the ceiling. She needed to think fast. The canyon was a trap. Now open, sky meant death, ground meant capture. She scanned the terrain below, looking for anything, any cover, any hope. Then she saw it. A thin line of dark smoke rising from a cluster of wreckage at the edge of the basin. The remains of an old downed aircraft, military markings, faded, almost gone. But she recognized them, her side. Her pulse surged. Maybe there were supplies, maybe a radio, maybe a miracle. She pushed the helicopter lower, ignoring the alarms, screaming from the dashboard, gunfire still echoing behind her. The other aircraft circled. Higher, cautious, unwilling to dive so low after her, perhaps thinking she was crashing anyway. The landing was rough metal screeching against stone, the helicopter skidding across the sand before coming to a shuddering stop. She ripped off the harness, her ears ringing, the world spinning, but she moved fast, jumping to the ground, ducking behind the wreckage. Smoke stung her eyes, the air hot and dry, but she crawled forward, reaching the old fuselage, the insignia almost erased by time. Her fingers brushed against metal, and she found what she had hoped for, a half-buried supply crate wedged beneath the debris. She pried it open, the hinges stiff with rust inside, lay a broken radio, a flare gun, and a small case marked emergency field kits. Grabbed everything, checking the flare chamber, one round left, maybe enough to signal, maybe enough to start a fire. Her breath came in sharp bursts, her pulse hammering in her throat. Above her, the sound of rotor blades deepened the enemy aircraft, circling lower, searching the basin. Their voices echoed faintly through the canyon, amplified by the wind as they closed in, methodical, relentless. She looked at the flare gun, her eyes narrowing, calculating timing, distance odds. She could hear the hum of their engines, now louder, closer. The vibration crawling up through the rocks into her bones. She raised the flare gun, her finger hovering over the trigger, waiting, counting heartbeats. The wind shifted, blowing sand across her face, and she thought of the general who had once told her no pilot could outfly death forever. She smiled to herself, a fierce, defiant smile, because she was about to prove him wrong or die trying. She took one last breath and pulled the trigger. The flare shot into the sky, trailing fire, its light reflecting in the mirrored helmets of the pilots above, and in that instant, she saw them react. Confusion, hesitation, and then something else, a flash of white light on the horizon that wasn't hers, growing larger, faster, unstoppable. The flare burned against the sky like a second sun, its light spilling across the canyon walls, painting everything in fire and shadow. Kara stared upward for a split second, unable to tell if the blinding flash approaching from the horizon was salvation or another threat. The roar that followed made the ground tremble, dust rising in thick waves around her, and the air turned heavy with the smell of burning fuel and ozone. She threw herself behind the wreckage, pressing against the cold metal as a shockwave tore through the basin, scattering debris like shrapnel. The enemy helicopters jerked off course, buffeted by the blast, one spinning wildly before disappearing behind a ridge in a trail of smoke. The other fought to regain balance, swaying drunkenly in the air, but Kara could see it losing altitude. She lifted her head slightly, just enough to see a column of dust rising where it hit the ground and a ball of flame blooming in slow motion against the desert. The explosion echoed through the canyon, long and hollow like thunder that refused to fade. For a moment, everything went still, only the hiss of burning fuel and the soft whisper of wind filling the silence. She could feel her pulse in her ears, her breath ragged and dry, her throat raw from the smoke. She glanced at the flare gun still hot in her grip, the barrel blackened and smoking. She hadn't planned for that blast. Whatever it was had come from far beyond her control, and she didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. She crawled from behind the wreckage, moving low, keeping her eyes on the ridge, scanning for movement. If anyone had survived the crash, they would regroup quickly and come for her. The helicopter she had stolen lay twisted a few hundred meters away, its tail sheared off, but the cockpit still mostly intact. She could see the faint glow of the control panel still alive, flickering faintly against the encroaching darkness. The sun was dropping fast behind, the cliffs turning the desert gold, then red, then gray, and she knew night would bring new dangers. Her boots crunched over broken glass and metal shards as she approached the downed helicopter, each step deliberate, her senses straining for sound. She could hear nothing but wind and the faint crackle of fire in the distance. Still, she knew better than to assume safety. She reached the cockpit, crouching low, and pried open the side door, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the controls blinked, weakly, the radio stuttering between static and faint signals. She adjusted the knobs carefully, trying to catch any transmission. Through the noise, a voice broke through, faint, distorted, someone speaking English, the first words from her. The desert sun burned mercilessly against the cracked earth as the convoy moved slowly through the barren wasteland, engines growling beneath a sky that seemed to stretch forever above them. The air shimmered with heat waves blurring the horizon. Into liquid gold and dust swirled around the armored trucks like restless spirits. Among the soldiers sitting in the back of the second vehicle, a woman kept her eyes low, wrists, bound, her face streaked with sweat and dirt. They thought she was beaten. Broken, just another prisoner in transit from one war to the next. Her name was Kara Holt, and until 48 hours ago, she had been a pilot. A decorated one, the kind of soldier who could land a helicopter blind in a sandstorm and still bring her team home. Now she sat motionless, her body aching from the restraints and dehydration, her thoughts razor-sharp beneath the exhaustion. She studied every bump, every turn, memorizing the rhythm of the convoy and the patterns of the guards as if her mind refused to accept defeat. She knew that somewhere ahead lay a small outpost, one with aircraft. She could almost hear the faint echo of rotors in her imagination. The lead truck jolted violently over a buried rock, and one of the guards cursed. Slamming his hand against the side rail, Kara lifted her eyes just slightly enough to see the guard nearest her, a tall man with a scar running down his neck, his rifle slung carelessly across his chest. He hadn't slept much. She could tell by the way his eyes darted nervously at every sound. She smiled inwardly, exhaustion fading for a moment because nervous guards made mistakes, and mistakes opened doors. As the convoy climbed a steep ridge, the radio crackled with static, a faint voice giving Orders from the command post ahead. The wind picked up, sweeping across the desert, carrying with it a strange silence between gusts. Kara's mind replayed the crash that had brought her here, the ambush in the canyon, the explosion that had flipped her helicopter into a twisted heap of metal and sand. She had crawled from the wreckage, only to be surrounded by men with guns, their insignias foreign, their language clipped and harsh. The general who had interrogated her claimed she was lucky. To be alive, she disagreed. The trucks began to slow their engines, grumbling under the strain, and Kara felt it in her chest, the subtle shift, the change in tone that told her they were approaching their destination. She looked up and saw the outpost. On the horizon, a cluster of prefabricated buildings and a single landing pad where the faint outline of a helicopter shimmered in the heat. Her pulse quickened, but her face remained calm, eyes half closed as though she were too weak to move. The guard beside her yawned, adjusting his grip on the rifle without realizing that she was watching every motion, every hesitation. They stopped at the outer gate, the convoy grinding to a halt, and the dust rose in thick clouds around them. The commander barked orders. Men moved quickly, unloading supplies, shouting over the roar of engines. Kara kept still waiting, listening, timing the chaos. Each sound became a signal, each movement a clue. The metal cuffs on her wrists were old military issue, not custom, and the chain between them had loosened slightly during the long ride. She twisted it subtly beneath her jacket, feeling the give in the metal, her heartbeat syncing with the distant thrum of the helicopter blades still spinning lazily on the pad. The guards began to argue near the lead truck, something about fuel or orders. She couldn't catch the words over the wind. The man with the scar leaned against the railing, lighting a cigarette, his rifle dangling from his shoulder. The barrel pointed at the dirt, and for the first time since capture, Kara felt the faint spark of opportunity. The soldiers were tired, overconfident, distracted, and in that fleeting moment of weakness, the balance shifted, though none of them knew it yet. The commander approached her truck, opening the rear door, shouting for the guards to move her inside for processing. His tone carried irritation, not suspicion, and the guards obeyed, hauling her to her feet, rough hands pushing her forward. The sunlight hit her face full force, blinding her momentarily, and she stumbled intentionally, forcing one of the guards to steady her, his grip tightening on her arm. Too close, she thought, close enough. She let her body sag as though from weakness, her eyes half lidded, but her mind was calculating distance and speed angles and timing, because she had been a pilot long enough to know that freedom required precision. The outpost walls loomed around her, a ring of corrugated metal and barbed wire. But beyond them, she could see the helicopter, its rotor catching the light like a signal from the heavens. The guards dragged her toward the main building, unaware that she had already loosened the lock on her cuffs, one twist, one distraction away from being free. Her heart pounded not from fear but anticipation, because she knew the sound of an engine, even from this distance, knew how long it took to start, knew how quickly it could become her way out. The commander turned his back, momentarily barking orders to a soldier near the gate, and Kara moved her wrist just enough to feel the cuff slide further. She flexed her fingers once-twice, feeling the blood return, warmth flooding her hands. She looked at the helicopter again, and in that instant, something inside her shifted. She wasn't a prisoner. She was a pilot, grounded but not broken. Her body might be restrained, but her mind was already in the sky, mapping the escape, the fight, the chaos that would follow. The guard with the scar looked back at her, cigarette hanging from his mouth, a smirk curling his lip as if to say, "You're not going anywhere." She met his gaze just for a heartbeat, letting the corner of her mouth twitch upward. Not in fear, but in promise. He frowned, uncertain, and that uncertainty was all she needed, because the next second she would move, and once she did, the desert would no longer be silent, and the sky would no longer belong to them. Kara stood in the glare of the desert sun, her mind racing faster than her pulse, the air heavy with heat and tension. the guards unaware that their prisoner was already thinking like a predator instead of prey. The commander was still speaking into his radio voice, sharp over the static barking orders about supplies. And transfer codes. The guards holding her shifted uneasily in the dust, waiting for instruction, and she used that moment to study every angle of the outpost, the gates, the fences, the shadows of the watchtowers, each one a potential opening, each one a calculated risk. The chain between her wrists slipped slightly, the metal almost soft now against her skin, her fingers twitching with restrained energy. The guard with the scar noticed her movement and sneered, thinking she was struggling from exhaustion. He yanked her forward, but she barely felt the pain. Her mind locked on the sound she had been waiting for. A faint whine in the distance, the lazy spin of helicopter blades shifting pitch with the rising wind. That sound meant everything. It meant proximity power. Escape the promise of air under her hands again. They led her through the open gate, the heat radiating off the metal walls, the smell of oil and sand thick in her lungs. She walked steadily, counting steps, noting the placement of every vehicle, the distance to the landing pad, the pattern of guards. She caught sight of a row of fuel barrels stacked too close to the storage shed, one bullet, one spark, and the whole place would erupt. She filed it away in her mind, knowing she might need chaos before the end. The commander turned back toward her, lifting his sunglasses, his expression one of boredom rather than suspicion. He motioned for her to be taken inside the processing tent, a small fabric structure with a single desk and a radio transmitter. She was pushed down onto a metal chair, her wrists still bound, but loose enough now that one hard pull could finish the job. The commander leaned against the table, staring at her with the kind of arrogance born from too many easy victories. "You think your army will come for you?" he said, his voice low. She said nothing, her silence sharper than any answer could have been. He smiled and looked away, tapping a file on the desk. He didn't see her testing the lock. One last time. The metal gave a little more, her pulse spiked. She could feel freedom just beyond her fingertips. The radio on the desk crackled suddenly, a voice speaking fast in a language she couldn't fully catch, but the tone was urgent. The commander frowned, reaching for the handset, and as he did, his attention wavered. That was all she needed. Her wrists twisted hard, the cuffs snapping open. She was free. Her hands shot forward before the guard beside her even realized what was happening. She slammed her elbow into his throat, and he crumpled without a sound. The second guard shouted, raising his weapon, but she was already moving, grabbing the fallen man's sidearm and firing once the bullet tearing through the tent. While outside chaos erupted. Shouts, gunfire, confusion. The commander dove behind the desk, yelling orders into the radio, but Kara was already gone, slipping through the side of the tent low to the ground, the heat and sand whipping around her. She ran toward the landing pad, the world narrowing to the sound of rotor blades and gunfire echoing off the walls. She saw the helicopter crew running, one climbing into the cockpit, another shouting into a headset. They hadn't realized yet that the danger was already inside the perimeter. She ducked behind a supply truck, bullets slamming into the metal near her head, shards of rust and paint spraying her face. She peered around the corner, spotting the fuel barrels again, and an idea sparked inside her, not reckless but precise. She aimed low, fired twice the rounds, hitting the base of the stack, a hiss of pressure building before flame caught the fumes, and the explosion ripped through the air. The blast knocked her to the ground, heat washing over her like a wave, but it